A lone calf surrounded by hyenas, a tragedy foretold. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and comment telling us where you're listening from. The African sun hung low on the horizon, painting the Serengeti plains in shades of gold and amber. Dr. Rachel Morrison crouched behind her Land Cruiser, camera in hand, documenting a herd of cattle that had wandered into the conservation area from a neighboring Maasai village. This wasn't unusual. The boundaries between human settlements and wildlife territory were porous at best, and cattle often strayed during the dry season, searching for the sparse grass that remained. Rachel had been working as a wildlife veterinarian in Tanzania for 6 years, ever since leaving her practice in Brisbane to pursue her dream of conservation work in Africa. At 38, she'd seen enough of nature's harsh realities to know that sentiment had no place in the wild. Survival was a numbers game, and the weak, the sick, and the unlucky rarely got second chances. But what she was watching through her binoculars made her stomach clench with dread. The cattle herd was moving steadily north, following an old migration route toward a water source, all except one. A young calf, probably no more than 3 months old, had somehow become separated from the group. It stood alone in a shallow depression, calling plaintively for its mother, its cream-colored coat stark against the golden grass. And circling that depression, just visible in the tall grass, were 7 spotted hyenas. Rachel lowered her binoculars and swore under her breath. She'd been tracking this particular clan for 2 months as part of her research on predator behavior in areas of human-wildlife conflict. She knew each animal, had named them, understood their hierarchy. The matriarch, a large female she called Scar for the distinctive mark across her muzzle, was leading the group. Beside her were younger females, 2 adolescent males, and a juvenile that was probably Scar's offspring from the previous year. The hyenas weren't attacking yet. They were doing what they did best, waiting, watching, testing. The calf was small enough to be easy prey, but it wasn't completely defenseless. Those sharp little hooves could break bones if the calf got lucky with a kick, and hyenas, despite their reputation, were pragmatic hunters. They preferred their kills to come with minimal risk of injury. Rachel's research partner, a Tanzanian ecologist named Joseph Molel, pulled up in his vehicle and walked over to where she stood. He took one look at the scene and shook his head. "The mother's already too far," he said quietly, nodding toward the distant herd, now just dark shapes against the horizon. "She won't come back, not with the clan there." "I know," Rachel replied, though her hand was already reaching for the tranquilizer rifle in her vehicle. "I know what the protocol is, Joseph. Non-interference. Let nature take its course." But it's hard to watch," Joseph finished for her. He'd worked with enough foreign researchers to recognize the internal conflict they all faced at some point. The intellectual understanding that predators needed to eat, that death was part of the ecosystem's balance, versus the emotional response to seeing a young, frightened animal facing certain death. "Rachel, we can't intervene. You know that. This isn't our cattle, and even if it was, the moment we interfere with natural predator behavior, we compromise our research. Everything we've documented for the past 2 months becomes questionable." Rachel knew he was right. She'd written papers on this exact topic, had argued passionately at conferences about the importance of maintaining scientific objectivity, of not allowing human emotion to interfere with wildlife management. But knowing something intellectually and living it were 2 very different things. The calf called out again, a high, desperate sound that carried across the plains. Through her binoculars, Rachel could see it turning in circles, searching for its herd, for its mother, for any familiar presence. The hyenas tightened their circle, moving closer with each pass. Scar made a low, whooping call, and the others responded, their distinctive laughing sounds eerily human in the fading light. "How long?" Rachel asked, not taking her eyes off the scene. "Minutes, maybe less." Joseph's voice was matter-of-fact, but Rachel could hear the strain in it. He felt it too. Even after a lifetime of living alongside these realities, they're just waiting for the right moment. Once one commits, the others will follow. It'll be quick. But it wasn't quick. The first hyena, one of the younger females, darted in and snapped at the calf's hindquarters. The calf wheeled around, faster than Rachel expected, and lashed out with its front hooves. The hyena yelped and backed off, a red gash across its muzzle. The clan paused, reassessing. The calf was small, yes, but it had spirit. Scar vocalized again, a different sound this time, commanding. The clan spread out, forming a wider circle. They were going to try a coordinated attack, coming from multiple directions, so the calf couldn't defend against all of them at once. Rachel had seen this tactic before, had documented it, had marveled at the intelligence and social cooperation it demonstrated, but she'd never watched it directed at something so young and helpless. The calf must have sensed the change in tactics. It bolted, running not toward the distant herd, which it could no longer see, but toward the only large shapes on the landscape it could identify, Rachel's and Joseph's vehicles. It ran with the desperate, ungainly gait of a young bovine, its legs too long for its body, its coordination not yet fully developed. The hyenas gave chase immediately, but they were pacing themselves, not committing to a full sprint. They knew the calf couldn't maintain that speed for long. Better to let it exhaust itself, make it easier prey. The distance between the calf and Rachel's position closed rapidly. 200 meters, 150. "Rachel," Joseph said, his voice carrying a warning, "don't do anything stupid." But Rachel was already calculating. The calf wasn't wildlife. It was domestic livestock, probably belonging to someone in the nearby village, someone's livelihood, someone's property, potentially someone's only valuable asset in a region where poverty was endemic. The rules were different for domestic animals, weren't they? That's what Rachel told herself as she made her decision. She jumped into her Land Cruiser and started the engine, driving directly toward the oncoming calf. The vehicle's sudden movement startled the hyenas, causing them to veer off momentarily. The calf, seeing the large vehicle approaching, changed direction at the last second, running alongside it rather than away. Rachel kept pace with the terrified animal, using her vehicle as a mobile barrier between the calf and the pursuing hyenas. Joseph was shouting something over the radio, but she ignored it. The hyenas were confused now, their hunt disrupted by this unexpected interference. Scar pulled up, vocalizing her frustration, and the rest of the clan stopped as well, watching the vehicle and the calf with wary intelligence. Rachel knew she couldn't keep this up indefinitely. The calf was already flagging, its sides heaving, foam flecking its muzzle. She needed to either get it somewhere safe or accept that she'd only delayed the inevitable. She scanned the landscape quickly. The Maasai village where the cattle likely belonged was at least 8 kilometers northwest, too far. But there was a tourist lodge about 3 kilometers east, with secure livestock pens they used for their own animals. She made her decision and radioed the lodge. "This is Dr. Morrison from the Conservation Project. I'm bringing in an injured calf. Need a pen ready?" "Yes, now, I'll explain later." The drive to the lodge was tense. Rachel had to keep her speed slow enough that the calf could keep up, but fast enough to discourage the hyenas from attempting another attack. The clan followed for the first kilometer, Scar leading, clearly unwilling to give up what should have been an easy meal. But as they got closer to the lodge, with its lights and human activity, the hyenas gradually fell back and disappeared into the gathering darkness. The calf collapsed the moment they reached the lodge grounds. Rachel jumped out and examined it quickly. Exhaustion, dehydration, minor lacerations from thorns, but nothing life-threatening. The lodge manager, a Kenyan woman named Grace, helped Rachel guide the calf into a small pen and provided water and hay. "Whose animal is this?" Grace asked, looking at the calf's unmarked ear. which suggested it hadn't yet been officially claimed by any particular family in the village. Don't know. The herd came from the northwest, probably the village near Olduvai. Rachel leaned against the pen rail, her adrenaline finally subsiding, replaced by a complex mixture of relief and professional guilt. I'll contact the village elder tomorrow. See if anyone's reported missing cattle. Joseph arrived 20 minutes later. His expression was carefully neutral, but Rachel could read the disapproval in his posture. They sat outside the lodge's main building, nursing cups of strong Tanzanian coffee, while Joseph laid out exactly what Rachel had compromised by her interference. You've just taught that hyena clan that vehicles mean lost prey. Every time they encounter a research vehicle now, their behavior will be altered. Our baseline data is corrupted. He wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. He was disappointed, and that's assuming the Ethics Review Board doesn't shut down our entire project when they hear about this. It was domestic livestock, Rachel argued, though the defense sounded weak even to her own ears. Not wildlife. The rules. The rules are about any interference with predator-prey dynamics in the study area. You know that. Joseph set down his cup. Look, Rachel, I understand. I felt the same way you did. But we have to maintain boundaries, or the work we're doing here, the research that could actually help both wildlife and local communities in the long term, becomes meaningless. Rachel knew he was right, but she couldn't bring herself to regret saving the calf. She'd seen too many deaths in her years here, had documented too many kills, had hardened herself to nature's brutality out of necessity. But every now and then, she needed to remember that compassion wasn't weakness, that choosing to act when you had the power to change an outcome was also a valid response. She spent the night at the lodge, checking on the calf every few hours. By morning it had recovered remarkably well, standing steadily and eating hay with good appetite. Rachel made calls to the nearby villages, describing the calf and its approximate age. By mid-afternoon, a young Maasai man named Lekishon arrived, having walked the 8 kilometers from his village. He looked at the calf through the pen rails, his face impassive in that way the Maasai had of not showing emotion to strangers. But Rachel had been in Tanzania long enough to read the subtle signs of relief in the relaxation of his shoulders, the way his hand gripped the rail. "This is your family's calf?" she asked in Swahili. "My sister's." Lekishon's voice was quiet. "She's 12. This calf was born 3 months ago from her favorite cow. She's been crying since yesterday when we realized it was missing." He looked at Rachel directly. "How did you find it?" Rachel explained, leaving out the details about the research protocols she'd violated. Lekishon listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "The hyenas would have killed it," he said finally. "It wasn't a question." "Yes. Then you saved its life. My sister will want to thank you." "That's not necessary." Rachel felt uncomfortable with the gratitude, given that she was still grappling with whether she'd done the right thing professionally. "Just make sure it doesn't wander off again. The dry season is only going to get worse, and the predators are hungry." Lekishon arranged transport back to his village, and by evening, the calf was gone. Rachel returned to her research camp, where Joseph was waiting with news. The incident had already been reported to their project supervisor by someone at the lodge. There would be an inquiry, a review of Rachel's actions, possibly sanctions. "How bad?" Rachel asked. "Could be nothing. Could be removal from the project." Joseph shrugged. "Depends on how they interpret the protocols and whether they think your judgment is compromised." He paused. Was it worth it? Potentially throwing away 6 years of work here for one calf? Rachel thought about Lekishon's sister, crying over her missing calf, about the relief in the young man's eyes when he'd seen the animal safe, about the fact that in a region where so many people lived on the edge of subsistence, one calf could represent the difference between poverty and survival. "I don't know," she admitted. Ask me after the review. The review came 2 weeks later, conducted via video conference with the project's international board. Rachel presented her case, acknowledged her violation of protocol, and accepted responsibility for her actions. The board deliberated for 3 days before delivering their verdict. The board's decision was a compromise that satisfied no one completely. Rachel would receive a formal reprimand on her record, and her research would be subjected to additional oversight for the next 6 months. However, acknowledging the unique circumstances involving domestic livestock rather than pure wildlife, they would not remove her from the project. The lead investigator, a stern German ecologist named Dr. Klaus Werner, made it clear during the final video call that this was her only warning. "You are a talented researcher, Dr. Morrison, but talent means nothing without discipline. The protocols exist for reasons you understood when you signed on to this project. Another violation, and you're done. Not just here, but your reputation in the field will be permanently compromised. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir, I understand." After the call ended, Rachel sat in her tent, feeling the weight of what she'd risked. Joseph found her there an hour later, staring at her laptop screen without really seeing it. "Could have been worse," he offered, sitting on the camp stool across from her. "Could have been better." Rachel closed the laptop. 6 months of extra scrutiny means 6 months where I can't follow my instincts, where I have to second-guess every decision. That's going to affect the quality of my work. Maybe, or maybe it'll make you a better scientist. Joseph's tone was gentle but firm. "You're brilliant at what you do, Rachel, but you've always struggled with the emotional detachment this work requires. This might be the push you need to find that balance." Over the following weeks, Rachel threw herself into her research with renewed focus. She documented the hyena clan's behavior meticulously, noting that despite her fears, they hadn't significantly altered their hunting patterns around vehicles. If anything, they seemed to have dismissed the incident as an anomaly, which was both a relief and a reminder that perhaps she'd overestimated the impact of her interference. It was during this period that Lekishon returned to the research camp. He brought with him his younger sister, Nasserian, a shy 12-year-old girl who clutched a small beaded bracelet in her hands. Through Lekishon's translation, Nasserian explained that she'd made the bracelet herself and wanted to give it to Rachel as thanks for saving her calf. Rachel knelt down to the girl's level, accepting the gift. The beadwork was intricate. Traditional Maasai patterns in red, blue, and white. "Tell her it's beautiful. Tell her she didn't need to do this," Lekishon translated, and Nasserian responded in rapid Ma, her face earnest. "She says the calf is her future. When it grows and has calves of its own, those will be her dowry. You didn't just save an animal, you saved her future." The weight of those words settled on Rachel like a physical thing. She'd been so focused on the research implications, on the professional consequences, that she hadn't fully considered the human dimension of what she'd done. In saving that calf, she'd potentially changed the trajectory of this young girl's life. After Lekishon and Nasserian left, Rachel found herself thinking about the intersection of conservation and human welfare, something she'd always understood intellectually, but was now feeling viscerally. The Maasai had lived alongside wildlife for centuries, developing a complex relationship with the land and its creatures that Western conservation models often failed to fully account for. To them, cattle weren't just livestock. They were wealth, status, survival, and cultural identity all rolled into one. That evening, she had a long conversation with Joseph about it. "We spend so much time thinking about protecting wildlife from humans, but what about protecting humans from wildlife? Where's the balance?" "That's the question that's been plaguing conservationists for decades," Joseph replied. They were sitting around the campfire, the sounds of the African night surrounding them. My father was a ranger. He used to say that conservation that doesn't consider the people living in and around protected areas is just colonialism with a green face. So what do we do? How do we reconcile studying predator behavior without interference, while also acknowledging that those predators sometimes threaten people's livelihoods? We do our best. We gather data that helps inform better policies. We work with communities to find solutions that protect both wildlife and human interests. And sometimes, Joseph added with a slight smile, we make judgment calls that get us reprimands, but might be the right thing in the bigger picture. The months passed. Rachel's extra oversight period came and went without incident. Her research was yielding valuable data about hyena behavior in human-wildlife conflict zones, information that was being used to develop better livestock protection strategies for local communities. She presented her findings at a conference in Nairobi, where they were well received by both the scientific community and conservation practitioners working on the ground. It was at that conference that Rachel met Dr. Margaret Ochieng, a Kenyan wildlife biologist who'd spent 20 years working on human-wildlife coexistence. Over coffee, Margaret shared her own story of breaking protocol to save a young elephant that had fallen into a well. "I got a reprimand too," Margaret said with a wry smile. "But that elephant is now a 17-year-old matriarch with 3 calves of her own." Sometimes the data doesn't capture the full picture of what we're trying to achieve out here. "Which is what exactly?" Rachel asked. "Balance, coexistence, a future where both wildlife and people can thrive. The protocols and the objectivity are important tools, but they're not the ultimate goal. The goal is life continuing in all its messy, complicated forms." Rachel returned to her research camp with a new perspective. She maintained her scientific rigor, followed all protocols, but she also began a side project documenting the stories of local people and their relationships with wildlife. She interviewed pastoralists about livestock losses to predators, gathered data on traditional protection methods, and worked with village elders to understand their concerns and priorities. 6 months after the calf incident, Lekishon returned to the camp with news. Naserian's calf had thrived and was now nearly full-grown. More importantly, the family had used Rachel's intervention as a teaching moment in the village about protecting young livestock during the dry season. Grazing patterns had been adjusted, young animals were kept closer to the village, and livestock losses to predators had decreased significantly. "You started something," Lekishon told Rachel. "Not just saving one calf, but making people think differently about how to live alongside the predators. The elders want to meet with you to discuss ways the village and your research project might work together." That meeting led to a pilot program that Rachel would spend the next 2 years developing. A community-based livestock protection initiative that combined traditional Maasai knowledge with modern understanding of predator behavior. The program started small. Rachel worked with 3 families from Lekishon's village, helping them implement simple changes based on her hyena research. They adjusted grazing times to avoid peak predator activity periods, used reflective materials to create visual barriers around night pens, and established a rotation system so vulnerable young animals were never left isolated. The results were immediate and encouraging. Over 6 months, livestock losses in those 3 households dropped by 70%. Word spread quickly through the region. Other villages requested similar assistance. Rachel found herself transitioning from pure research to applied conservation, a shift that required approval from her project supervisors. To her surprise, Dr. Werner was supportive. "This is exactly the kind of real-world application we need," he told her during a review call. "You're creating a model that could be replicated across East Africa. Just don't lose sight of the baseline research that makes it all possible." Joseph became Rachel's key partner in expanding the program. His connections in local communities, his fluency in Ma and Swahili, and his deep understanding of both traditional practices and modern conservation made him invaluable. Together, they trained community members to become what they called wildlife ambassadors, locals who could bridge the gap between scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom. Naserian, now 13, became one of their youngest ambassadors. Her experience with the rescued calf had sparked a passion for understanding animal behavior. She attended every training session Rachel offered, asked thoughtful questions, and began keeping her own detailed observations of wildlife movements around her village. Rachel recognized something of herself in the girl's curiosity and determination. "She reminds me why I got into this field," Rachel told Joseph one evening. "That pure fascination with how animals think and behave before it gets complicated by grants and protocols and politics." "Maybe you should mentor her properly," Joseph suggested. "There are scholarship programs for rural students interested in wildlife biology. She could be the next generation of East African conservationists." The idea took root. Rachel began working with Naserian more formally, teaching her basic research methods, helping her improve her English, connecting her with educational resources. The girl's parents were initially hesitant about their daughter spending time on anything other than traditional roles. But when they saw how the knowledge benefited their livestock management, they became supportive. 2 years after the calf incident, Rachel was invited to present her community-based conservation model at an international symposium in Cape Town. She brought Naserian with her, the girl's first time on an airplane, her first time in a city, her first exposure to the broader world of wildlife conservation. Watching Naserian's eyes widen as she saw the ocean for the first time, as she met scientists from around the world, as she realized the possibilities that existed beyond her village, Rachel felt a deep sense of purpose that had been missing in her early research years. The presentation was a success. Several conservation organizations expressed interest in funding expansion of the program. More significantly, Rachel was approached by representatives from the Tanzanian Wildlife Authority about developing a national framework based on her model. The work she'd started by breaking protocol to save one calf had evolved into something that could potentially protect thousands of animals, both wild and domestic, while improving livelihoods for countless families. But success brought its own challenges. As the program grew, Rachel found herself spending more time on administration and less on direct research. She struggled with the transition, missed the quiet hours observing hyena behavior, the simplicity of data collection and analysis. She confided these feelings to Margaret Ochieng during one of their regular video calls. "You're mourning your old identity," Margaret said with understanding. "You were a researcher, and now you're becoming something else, a program director, a community liaison, a mentor. It's natural to grieve that loss, even while embracing the new role. How did you manage it? When you made the same transition?" "I didn't, not at first." Margaret smiled ruefully. "I tried to do everything, burned myself out and had to take a year off to recover. My advice, decide what matters most to you now, not what mattered 5 years ago. People change, and that's not failure, that's growth." Rachel took that advice to heart. She made the difficult decision to step back from active fieldwork and focus on program development and mentoring. She brought in younger researchers to continue the hyena studies, including a promising Tanzanian graduate student who'd grown up in a Maasai community and brought invaluable perspective to the work. It felt like letting go of part of herself, but it also felt right. 3 years after the calf incident, Rachel stood in the same spot where she'd first seen the young animals surrounded by hyenas. The landscape looked much the same. Golden grass stretching to the horizon, acacia trees dotting the plains, the eternal African sky overhead. But so much had changed beneath that surface sameness. The community conservation program now operated in 15 villages. livestock losses to predators had dropped an average of 65% across all participating communities. More importantly, retaliatory killings of predators had virtually ceased in program areas. People were learning to live alongside hyenas, lions, and leopards, not as enemies, but as neighbors sharing a landscape. Nasserian was now 16 and had just been accepted to a prestigious wildlife biology program at the University of Dar es Salaam with a full scholarship. She would be the first person from her village to attend university. Rachel had written one of her recommendation letters, describing not just the girl's academic potential, but her deep understanding of the practical challenges facing conservation in East Africa. Joseph walked up beside Rachel, following her gaze across the plains. "Thinking about that day? Always, every time I come out here." Rachel touched the beaded bracelet on her wrist, the one Nasserian had given her all those years ago. She never took it off. "I broke every rule I'd been taught about non-interference, risked my career, compromised my research, and yet it led to all this," Joseph finished. "Sometimes the right choice isn't the one the protocol manual tells you to make." "Do you think I'd do it again? If I could go back, knowing what I know now?" Joseph considered this carefully. "I think you'd do exactly what your conscience told you to do in that moment. That's who you are, Rachel. That's why the program works, because it's not just about science or data. It's about recognizing that every decision we make in conservation affects real lives, human and animal." As they walked back to their vehicles, Rachel spotted a herd of cattle in the distance, grazing peacefully. Among them were several young calves, none separated, all protected by the vigilant presence of their mothers and the community's improved management practices. Somewhere in that herd might be the descendants of the calf she'd saved, carrying on their genetic line, because one scientist had chosen compassion over protocol. The sun was setting, painting the Serengeti in those same gold and amber shades Rachel had seen on that fateful evening. But the landscape no longer felt like a stage for inevitable tragedy. It felt like a place of possibility, where humans and wildlife could find ways to coexist, where one small act of mercy could ripple outward into lasting change, where the future was still being written by people willing to care enough to try.